Today is November 4th, 2024. This is episode 58 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I am joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will do version 3 of our football power rankings. We did them in between the season. We did them at the beginning of October, and here we are, Joe, at the beginning of November. So, Joe, we will throw up the power rankings. For those who are audio only, you're just going to have to hang in there with us. Our October 3rd power rankings are right there. And Joe, I do think we have a couple of changes in store here, a number of seriously big results. But Joe, let's start it off reverse alphabetical order this time. Let's go to Wisconsin. So tell us what's happened with the Badgers since we last ranked these teams.
Yeah, Sean, Wisconsin's had quite the month. Last time we talked about them, they were in a bit of a tumultuous stretch, losing that tough one to Alabama and then losing Tyler Van Dyke for the year. That's certainly not the way you want to go about your early September and early part of the season. But since then, they rattled off 3 really impressive wins, dominating wins, I should say, against Purdue, Rutgers, and Northwestern. Now, if you look at it on the surface, you'd say, well, of course, it's Wisconsin. They're more talented than all 3 of those teams. But based off after they got crushed by USC in that second half, it looked really encouraging. Unfortunately, the second half against Penn State, followed by the thrashing Iowa gave them, kind of brought them right back to where they are right now. So, yeah, Sean, I think Wisconsin started off the month well, but certainly returned right back down to earth really quickly.
All right, Joe, where do you have them?
I got Wisconsin at 11th, Sean.
Okay, I've got them just one spot higher in 10th. I do think it was probably the toughest one to rank. Had we done it a couple weeks ago, maybe they could have been even higher. But, they do get a bunch of those good wins there. It looked like they got things going. And then, like you said, it's been pretty rough the last, 6 quarters of football that they've played. So the Badgers come in at 10th for me, 11th for you, Joe. It's a jump from 13th for you and 15th for me. All right, Joe, we'll go to the other W school now. This is the Washington Huskies, the defending national runner-ups. They came in a little bit of a herky-jerky start to the season, but since our last rankings, they beat Michigan at home. They do get 40 dropped on them by Iowa, same as Wisconsin just did. They go into Bloomington and lose by 2 touchdowns, and then they beat USC by 5. So, Joe, it was mediocre last time for Washington. It's kind of more of the same.
Yeah, Sean, I don't think Washington's done anything too shocking this year, and I don't mean that in a terrible way either. I think your first year, you kind of want to avoid the major disasters. One thing I do want to highlight, they are 5-4, and that's significant because that includes wins over not only revenge for the Natty against Michigan, maybe not total revenge, I'll be very clear, but also big win over USC. That's a rivalry that transcends whatever conference they've been in, whether it's been the Pac-12 or the new look Big Ten. So I do think Washington is on the right track. I do still think they are a middle of the pack team, although they have stretched their way toward the upper middle of the pack. So Sean, before I give my ranking, I want to hear yours.
Yeah, I've got them moving up into 8th. I think the other teams that end up in this spot, Joe, they beat a couple of them, and they're better than the ones that they haven't, and that's a little bit of a teaser. But, at this point of the year, a head-to-head matchup, especially if it's come since our last ranking, I think you need to give Washington the edge over that team. So I've got them up in 8th from 11th, which we both had them last time.
Yeah, Sean, and I'm on the same wavelength. I do also have the Huskies at 8th. I know a lot of people nationally had that, so we're not going to make too many headlines with that ranking, but I do think it's the most fair ranking. And it is ahead of teams like ones we're going to mention later that they've beaten. So I think it's more than fair.
All right, Joe, we'll go over to USC and Lincoln Riley. Since the last time that we ranked the teams, it's been a tough stretch for the Trojans. They lose on the road at Minnesota. They lose a tough one at home in overtime to Penn State. A tough one on the road at Maryland. They do get by Rutgers, and then they lose that game to Washington. So, Joe, what started off as a highly promising season for USC, and they have won just 2 of their last 6 ball games. They are just 4-5 on the year, 2-5 in the Big Ten. So Joe, I had them in fourth, you had them in fifth. They're going down the rankings, that's for sure.
Yeah, Sean, this is probably the most disappointing team and the team that's going to have one of the more significant drops, probably the most significant drop in our power rankings. One thing that's been astonishing is their lack of ability to finish games. Now, the Michigan one you could chalk up as a few big plays, and that's more than fair, especially after the way we ranked them after they beat Wisconsin. You'd think, all right, they figured this out. And even in certain games, even after they lost the weird game to Minnesota. They looked like they were on the verge of knocking Penn State off, who was undefeated at the time, and they just couldn't do it. They got conservative at the end. They couldn't make the big plays, and then offensively was anemic in those three plays in overtime, leading them to miss that field goal and whatnot. And that's been the story all year, Sean. Uh, the blocked field goal against Maryland. I mean, you couldn't even make a lot of this up. And unfortunately, those are all games they probably should have won, except they ended up losing all five of them. So, Sean, in the four they've lost in the stretch since, I got to put USC at 13th. That's pretty shocking to me because I think talent-wise, this is a top five team in the conference. And if you told me they would drop 8 spots from my original ranking, I probably would have laughed at you. But here we are. It's been the wackiest year of college football I remember since 2007. And USC dropping toward the bottom end of the conference certainly has to be up there.
Yeah, Joe, I've got them just one spot ahead in 12th. There's a lot of teams in here in the middle of the pack that the three teams we've mentioned are already. And, if you watched one of the teams' games that they looked good in, you're going to think they're better. And if you watched one of the games where they laid an egg, then you're going to put them lower. There's not much separating these teams right now. I've got USC in 12th, and it's just been a really disappointing season for a team that looked, destined for a college football playoff appearance at one point this year. All right, Joe, we'll go to the other UCLA team. They were 17th in my power rankings last time around and 18th in yours. And, Joe, I do think they are moving up, but they still sit at 3-5. They are 2-2 since our last rankings. A tough loss on the road in Happy Valley, a loss at home to Minnesota, a win on the road at Rutgers, and a win on the road at Nebraska. So UCLA all of a sudden 3-5, starting to turn around their year one in the Big Ten.
Yeah, and I really want to give credit to Deshaun Foster and this entire coaching staff, Eric Bieniemy included. The way they had no efficiency offensively from the time they played Oregon on September 28th to the way I thought, don't let the 27-11 fool you. They were really creative in that game against Penn State. I thought Justin Martin being a first-time starter in that game, 22 of 30, 167 yards, didn't throw a pick, didn't really turn the ball over either, except for a fumble he put on the ground, but they didn't lose it. So you look at this. 11 points, 17 points in a loss, 35 and 27. Those 35 and 27 were the wins on the road against Rutgers and Nebraska. Two teams that were favored to beat them, Sean. I'm really impressed. At 3-5, you look at the rest of their schedule. We could certainly get into that on our next podcast, but I really think UCLA had one of the more, not the biggest jumps in terms of rankings, but biggest jumps in terms of performance because they looked like a team that didn't even look like a Power 4, let alone a respectable Division 1 team. And right now, they're 3-5 with 2 wins with 2 wins as road underdogs, which is extremely hard to do in modern college football. With that said, Sean, give me the Bruins to be in 14th place. I know maybe only a 3-4 point jump for a lot of you, but certainly one that I did not foresee. I thought they'd be in that basement cellar at 17-18 the entire year.
Yeah, Joe, I've got them in 16th. I do think that's, as much of a jump I can give them. It's just coming from a really low floor, and now they're probably playing better football right now than a couple of the teams above them in mine, but, it's not just a recency thing here. Their defense was always supposed to be pretty good. It was bad early on. It looks like they're finding their footing a little bit there, and as everybody knows, when you're scoring points, it's a lot easier to play defense when you're not out there 3/4 of the time. So I've got UCLA in 16th. You've got them in 14th, and we'll move up to the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, Joe. Another contender for biggest drop. It's been tough sledding for them since our last rankings. In fact, they have not won a football game They did not go. They went the whole month of October winless. A loss at Nebraska, a big home loss at home to Wisconsin, a home loss to UCLA, and then a loss on the road in Los Angeles against USC. Joe, it's been a pretty tough month for the Scarlet Knights.
It's been a remarkably bad month. I think the way we talked about Rutgers at 4-0 after that huge win against Washington, I really thought they'd turn the corner as a program, and maybe I thought this was a year they could sneak in 8, 9 wins, and maybe they could have been the Indiana of the conference. Not necessarily ranked number 8, but maybe in playoff contention with a relatively, not weak schedule, but relatively softer schedule than most of their conference foes. Now, Sean, I think the main reason behind this is their defensive collapse, and that's really led to them not being able to play complementary football. Digging holes early. You looked at the Nebraska game, that wasn't that terrible a game. You gave up 14 points. I thought that was just a bad day for the offense. But ever since, getting torn up by Wisconsin, letting UCLA's offense run wild, and then, I thought the USC game was pretty inevitable based on their recent skid. So, all that said, Sean, Rutgers drops, and this is going to be a significant drop, all the way to 17 for me, right? One out of the cellar, and that's really because their run of games has been unacceptable. It's fine to lose a few of those games, but to lose all of them in the fashion they did, I can't name one remarkable thing either unit did in any of those 4 games.
Yeah, I've got them in 15th, Joe. It's a long drop for Rutgers here, and they did do some good things early on, which is why I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt on the body of work here. But in terms of the season going off the rails, it's hard to argue a team that's the case more so than this Rutgers team. It's they had a formula to winning games, and while they weren't beating the best teams in the country, they certainly were beating all right teams. And now a couple teams they're probably better than UCLA, and they come into their field and beat them pretty good. So it's been a tough month for Rutgers. All right, up next, Joe, we're going to go to Purdue, another team that's had a really rough go about it here. They are 1-7 overall and 0-5 in the Big Ten. They are 0-4 since our last ranking. Joe, they did have one very, very close call on the road in Champaign against Illinois, where the Fighting Illini had to squeak out a 50-49 victory. Other than that, they did lose their chance for probably their best chance for a win the rest of the way at home against Northwestern in overtime, and then they lost 52-6 to Wisconsin and 35-0 to Oregon. Now, Joe, they're most likely going to be in the bottom of the conference. They are for me. They're in 18th. They're staying there, and there's not really been much of an update since the last time we talked.
No, Sean, I think they've played against better. I mean, the fact they were close at the end, got Northwestern to overtime's a positive based on where they were, especially based on where they were when they got blown out and like really run off the field in 1/2 against Notre Dame. But there's no other way to put it, Sean. If you're winless in this conference, you're going to have to be bottom of the conference, and that's what Purdue is. And I don't really feel like explaining it any further.
All right, as we go up the list to pretty much the entire top half is still available, Joe, and one of those spots will be filled by the Penn State Nittany Lions. James Franklin and his team were undefeated until a couple of days ago at the time of recording, but now they sit 7-1 overall and 4-1 in the conference. Since our last recording, they have victories against UCLA, on the road at USC, on the road at Wisconsin, and then a tough home loss to Ohio State by a touchdown. Joe, Penn State is still ranked 6th in the country. They're still probably going to be in the college football playoff, but James Franklin fails yet another test in a big game. Now, how would that affect your power rankings?
They're going to, well, I think from our last rankings, they're not going to drop too much, but keep in mind that's about the context. Now, one thing I do want to say is we're going to cover the James Franklin failure in big games, that 0-7 record against Michigan and Ohio State since fans were let back in the stadium following the pandemic. Believe me, we will cover that very soon because I do want to go in depth about that. But for now, Sean, I just want to assess their month as a whole. I thought overall it was pretty good. You do that on paper. You remove the Penn State out of it. You remove the James Franklin out of it. That's pretty acceptable. The most fan bases in the country and even most blue bloods in the country gasped. I know I said it. Penn State, give me them in 4th. I do think they are one of the better teams in the conference still, but one thing that's preventing me from, even had they beaten Ohio State, preventing me from putting them in the top two was the fact their passing game seems to not really click. The run game doesn't seem to be there in big games at times, and I think Andy Kolodnicki's done an outstanding job this year, but Saturday really discouraged me. And hypothetically, if they played Oregon or Indiana, I do not think they would be able to keep up.
Yeah, and Joe, we'll talk about that game more in depth in our actual weekly recap episode. But it's pretty clear that the three teams above them are better than them at this point, and it's not for a lack of talent. It's not for a lack of fans, atmosphere. It's just they're not as good. It's just really that simple. I've got them in fourth as well, as the YouTube viewers are already aware, because I slid them in there, and it looks like it's just going to be another 10-2, 9-3 type season for Penn State. Now that is good enough to get into the college football playoff, but it doesn't look like that they're going to get over that hump that they've been searching for years. All right, Joe, we'll go to the number one team in the country now. That is the Oregon Ducks. It's been a impressive start to life in the Big Ten for Dan Lanning and his crew. They are 4-0, 5-0 since our last recording. They win at Michigan State. They win at home against Ohio State in a game that really could have gone either way. They blank Purdue. They smoke Illinois, and they go on the road to the Big House and win. Joe, since that Ohio State game where they may have gotten a little bit lucky to come out on top, they have been inserting their will against anybody that comes into their path, and they are rightfully so the number one team in the country, and that means for me that they're number one in the Big Ten too.
Yeah, Sean, quite simply, they're number one in the Big Ten. One thing I want to talk about progression-wise is the Michigan State game on that Friday night, first Friday of October. Dylan Gabriel made some terrible decisions, throwing two picks in the red zone within the 5-yard line, I believe.
Early in the game, too.
Early in the game. Ever since then, including the Ohio State game, his decision-making's been a lot better. I think the sole bad decision on that team was the spitting in the Ohio State game, something we've been over in depth, so no need. You can go back to our past episodes and examine that. But Sean, this is what a number one team does. They dominate lesser opponents. Maybe the Michigan score 38-17 you'd think was a domination. It really wasn't. But at the end of the day, Oregon knows the kind of game they had to play. They just didn't have to get in their own way, and they didn't. They committed very few penalties. And in all these games, they're committing very few penalties. They're not turning the ball over at all. And they're being efficient offensively. And there's so many ways they can beat you, whether it's Ferguson, Tez Johnson, who I do think will be back at some point, Evan Stewart, Jordan James, Dylan Gabriel himself, whether that's through the air or on the ground. The guy can't be sacked either, I might add. Oregon, really impressive and a national title contender, without a doubt. Got to be in the top three national title contenders for most people in this country.
All right, Joe, another team that is likely to be near the top of our rankings. It's the team that Oregon beat by just a point. It is the Ohio State Buckeyes, who sit at 7-1 on the season, 4-1 overall. Since our last rankings, they have a big win over Iowa, that lost to Oregon, a rather close call against Nebraska at home, and we haven't talked about them yet, Joe, and we'll see where they end up, the Cornhuskers. And then a nice, impressive touchdown victory on the road in Happy Valley. Now, Joe, we talked about the loss to Oregon being that they might still be the better team, or at least equal to them. But these last 2 weeks for me are taking the argument away a little bit. Really, the Nebraska game. Had they blown them out, maybe you could have an argument for Ohio State still being number one, which they were for us in October. But at this point, they have to be number two. They did make quite a few mistakes in that Penn State game that the Nittany Lions were unable to capitalize on, whether it was that Will Howard fumble at the 1-yard line or plenty of others, really. But they're still in a good place. They still just have the one loss to Oregon, and they've got a pretty big matchup coming up against the Indiana Hoosiers. But, Joe, Ohio State's got to be second, right?
Yeah, without a doubt, Ohio State's second. And if you want to march it, it's literally by a point or 2 points, let's call it. Had Ohio State kicked the field goal, I really think they'd be number one, not only in the country, but in our power rankings as well. I know which one's more important, believe me. I'm really interested to see. Right now, we're recording this on a Monday. You might be listening to this before or after the real big event Tuesday. No, it's not the election. It's the college football playoff rankings reveal. I'm interested to see where they're at. I would guesstimate that they got to be three or four, four at the worst. But Sean, the Nebraska game, I'm gonna put a mulligan on because of the way they played against Penn State. That's a game they could have easily won 35-13. And Penn State being the fourth best or third best team in this conference, most people would credit uh, dominating them in the way they did, especially that last drive. That's something we haven't seen out of Ohio State since 2019, the ability to exercise the run game, and especially when the passing game wasn't all there. I thought the first half was a lot better. Second half, being able to find other ways to win. Really good on Ohio State. Really good for Ryan Day, who that's probably the biggest win of his career since the 2021 semifinal game against Clemson. That's his biggest win, without a doubt.
So at this point, Joe, we've got a spot open in third. It's pretty evident who that will be, but we're going to go to the Northwestern Wildcats first. And it's been an incredibly up and down season for them while they play in their temporary stadium there out on Lake Michigan. And the Northwestern Wildcats are 4-5 on the year, 2-4 in the conference since our last recording. They have a lopsided home loss to Indiana, a big win on the road at Maryland, a big loss at home to Wisconsin, a big loss to Iowa, and then they did get the job done in West Lafayette against Purdue. So, Joe, it'll be interesting to see where you have Northwestern. They ended up in 16th. For both of us last time around, are they moving up or are they moving down? Or are they staying the same?
They're barely moving up, Sean. Give me Northwestern at 15th. Uh, I do not think this team has gotten that much better. I do think the Maryland win was great, but it was really a flash in the pan, unfortunately for them. I thought the way they got dominated by Indiana in that second half has been the indicator for what they've done lately. And yes, I know they got the win over Purdue, but needing three overtimes to beat Purdue. I'm not going to begrudge you for it because winning on the road in the Big Ten, I don't care who it's against, is tough, but it's not really going to move the needle either.
Yeah, Joe, I've got them one spot higher in 14th. It's just simply that they're better than the teams below them. I think they've had a couple of good performances and they've been a little bit unpredictable. And you had to win that Purdue game, and at the end of the day, you did win it. But they were very close to being 17th in the rankings, I think, had they lost that one to the Boilers, because the Boilers weren't coming out of the bottom. But they do get the job done there. They are in a spot where they might be able to sneak a bowl. They do have Illinois and Michigan left. Maybe it's unlikely for sure, but at this point, they are 4-5, 2-4. It could be worse for Northwestern with the roster that they have. All right, we'll keep moving up the list, Joe, and we'll go to Nebraska. Dylan Raiola and the Cornhuskers, 5-4 overall in the season and 2-4 in the conference. Joe, another big decrease in vibes from this team since our last recording. They do beat Rutgers 14-7. They get smoked by Indiana 56-7. Close call at the shoe against Ohio State, as we stated earlier. And then just last week, they do lose at home to UCLA. Joe, Nebraska, 9th in my rankings last time, 10th in yours, likely going down.
Yeah, Sean, going down in a big way, not only in vibes, as you said, but in the rankings as well from where they were. They were middle class. Now I think they're looking in the lower class. Give me Nebraska for 14th, and I just want to make sure there's not an error there, Sean. There's 14th.
You got UCLA 14th.
UCLA 14th. The list is messed up.
You got USC 13th, UCLA 14th, Northwestern 15th, Open 16th. Do you want me to slide UCLA Northwestern down?
No, Nebraska 14th. My bad, Sean. Made a typo. All right, Nebraska 15th. Apologies.
All right, Northwestern's 15th. So bump Northwestern down.
All right, my bad, Sean. I messed up the list. Bump Northwestern down and put Nebraska at 15.
All right.
Apologies, viewers. That's completely on me. I miscalculated my list.
It's all right. It's tough. It is live, Joe. So if you want to look on the YouTube feed, you can check in.
Oh, that's way better. I did not know.
Yeah, it's a little delayed for you, but they're going down, Joe, and there's some questions being asked about their coach, about the quarterback, and And while they did probably receive too much hype coming in, we did think they could be a good football team. And unfortunately for them, that's not really the case. I've got them in 13th, just a couple of places higher. And it's been tough. Whoops, wrong button there. It is tough for Nebraska to see a way through here. They were in the top 25. They have USC, Wisconsin, and Iowa next. 3 teams that are probably all better than them at this point. So they do just need one for a bowl. They are 5-4 overall, but unfortunately for Nebraska, I think it's not the season that they were hoping for. That's for sure. All right, up next, Joe, probably one of the biggest risers since the last time we talked. That's the Minnesota Golden Gophers. PJ Fleck and the team started off really unfortunate with a couple close losses that could have gone either way, but now they sit at 6-3 and 4-2 in the conference. Since our last recording, they knocked off USC, they knocked off UCLA, they smoked Maryland, and they go on the road and beat a ranked Illinois team. Joe, had a couple of those early losses gone the other way, Minnesota would be looking really good right now. And they're 6-3, just outside the top 25. Stock up for the Gophers.
Stock up 1,000%. I do wonder whether they'll be ranked in the top 25 tomorrow. I highly doubt it, but I think if there's any 3-loss team that deserves to be in the conversation, Minnesota's at the forefront of it, Sean. I think that's said very clearly. I think the turning point of their season was after the first half against Michigan. They dominated Michigan in the second half. And ever since then, Sean, they've played really clean football. Max Brosmer's been great. He's given them more options, not only by him running the ball, which he did earlier, but now throwing the ball. He looks a lot more comfortable in the pocket. They're able to do a lot more on offense, and the defense has stood up right at the right moments. So with that said, Sean, I like Minnesota for 6th place. They are one of the biggest risers in the conference, and frankly, if I had a team of the month in the conference, sure, it's got to be Oregon. Indiana has probably been team of the year, at least in terms of surprise. But Minnesota wouldn't be far behind. I'd argue Minnesota was my second team of the month, aside from Indiana.
Yep, I've got them in the same place, Joe. And now the viewers can see we've got 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8 all locked up. That was not intentional. But we do have the Golden Gophers in 6th. That's been impressive, and let's hope for their sake that they can continue it. All right, as we go up the list, Joe, we've got your Michigan Wolverines up next. The defending champions. Has not been the best month for Sharon Moore and Big Maize and Blue. They start off the month with a loss at Washington, another loss at Illinois. They do win the rivalry game against Michigan State, which at least for now looks like it's, stopped the bleeding for a little bit. And then what was a pretty decent effort overall, and they end up just losing. They end up losing pretty big to Oregon. But, Joe, it's 5-4 for this Wolverines team, 3-3 in the conference. And unfortunately for them, they've been driven straight into the middle of this pack.
Yeah, Sean, that's exactly where I'm going to have them. I'm going to have them in 9th place, teetering on the edge. I'm curious to see where you have them. Real quick, Sean, before you touch on it, I think Michigan's had some solutions to their issues. They've finally settled on Davis Ward as quarterback, who they thought was the problem. In the recording since, we had Jack Tuttle become the savior for a half, then retire, and then back to the 2 QB system where we started. So I find Michigan, the consensus, and we'll do this at the end of the year, Michigan should have probably just stuck with Davis Ward at this rate through the entire season. With that said, Sean, the defense has not shown much progress, unfortunately, and injuries have played a factor here. They've been without Derek Moore offensively. They've been without Miles Hinton. They've been without on defense Will Johnson for most of the season. So none of that's really helps Sean. Really disappointing year for Michigan regardless. Although I thought the last 2 efforts, particularly the Michigan State one and at times against Oregon, were signs of improvement from the abysmal performances in the second half against Washington and the entire game against Illinois. So Michigan, 9th place for me.
Yep, same for me. I think they were a little less unpredictable, and I really don't think it was a terrible effort against Oregon. The fact is the Ducks are just a better team, and they won the game handily, but you were hanging on a little bit there. So I do want to give Michigan a little bit of credit for that, because there were a couple Michigan performances where that would have been 47-0. But they were able to hang tough for a little bit, and ultimately they just come up short. They just don't have the firepower to hang with these big teams, which was a worry early, and unfortunately it's a reality now. All right, we'll go up the list again. Joe, to the Spartans, your rivals. You just beat. An extremely up and down season for the Spartans has continued through the month of October, as the schedule is not loading here for me. All right, here we go. They do lose on the road big at Oregon in that Friday night game. They do beat Iowa at home in an impressive performance. They lose that one on the road, the rivalry game against Michigan. And then despite leading 10-0 after the first quarter, they have 47 unanswered dropped on them by Indiana. And Joe, the Spartans are 4-5. They are 2-4 overall. It's been a mixed bag for the Spartans, and unfortunately, they haven't really had much consistency. They've been incredibly beat up. What's the pulse on the Spartans season, at least in the last month?
John, I think the last month, you look at the Oregon game, you look at the Michigan game, and you certainly look at the Indiana game for lows. But I do think the Iowa game showed the tremendous ceiling this team has. They beat up on one of the upper tier teams of this conference who we're going to rank later. They really dominated them. They didn't. I believe they didn't even punt the ball once against them, which is amazing. They finished every drive with a kick, without being a punt. Think about that. This was either a field goal or an extra point. Aiden Childs had one pick at that game, and the offense looked as efficient as ever. And they stopped Caleb Johnson, period, point blank, aside from the 175-yard TD run. I think Michigan State showed flashes of that, especially against Michigan and even Oregon at the beginning of the month. Unfortunately for the Spartans, their bottom is really low, and they bottomed out against Indiana. I don't want to overreact to that one game, which is why I do have Michigan State in 10th place. I really believe that the Wisconsin getting blown out by Iowa is the deciding factor in this. Perhaps that's recency bias, but if you made Michigan State and Wisconsin play against each other, I think that'd be a really even game. But the Spartans' ceiling, especially with Aiden Childs, who I know is heavily critiqued, is a lot higher than Wisconsin's.
Yeah, I've got them in 11th, just one spot below, Joe. Their range is incredibly big. It's probably the biggest of any team in this league. They looked like they were going to win the football game against Indiana. Childs was making great throws. He was finding his superstar, Nick Marsh, and then Indiana scores a couple of times, makes Childs chase the game, and he turns the ball over. I think he has grown a little bit this season, but still those mistakes are there that at this point you probably wanted those out. But 11th for me, 10th for you. And it's a slight bump up from where we had them last month. I had them in 13th, you had them in 12th. So slight bump up for the Spartans, but not much overall. All right, Joe, up next is Maryland. And any viewer who's watched will know where this team will go, because the three teams above them are better. And it's a little bit of a discrepancy for us. It's been just a bad season all around for the Terrapins. They're at 4-4 overall and 1-4 in the conference. And Joe, it wasn't a great month of October that had 3 games. 1-2, they did beat USC at home. Rather lucky to win that, in my opinion. They get smoked by Northwestern at home, and they do get 25-pieced by PJ Fleck in Minnesota. So, Joe, it's stock down for sure for Maryland. And just a lot of disappointment for the Terrapins in a season where we thought that they might have a chance to get to the middle of the pack.
Yeah, Sean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This has not been a great year for Maryland. I do think they've had signs of brilliance, particularly against USC. The reason I'm having them in 12th, which is going to stun a lot of people, is simply because they beat USC.
Well, they did, yeah.
So that's why they're in 12th. I do think Maryland, I think Billy Edwards Jr., had he been on a better team, and if he's on a better team next year, wink, wink, will be one of the bigger stars in college football. That's the only reason they're ranked 12th for me, Billy Edwards Jr.
Yep, I've got him in 17th, but it's just they're playing bad right now, and I don't think there's really a whole lot separating Purdue not included in this really 11th through 17th. I think it's a lot of mid in there, and a couple, maybe a good performance a month, in there from each team, and that's about it. But all right, Joe, we got 3 I schools left, and it's pretty clear that I think we're going to have these 3 in the same spot, which means that we're going to match up on the top 9, which is pretty impressive. We've got the Iowa Hawkeyes here. They come in again, another mixed bag. They do have a little bit of an offense this year. That's something that they haven't had for years, really. They sit 6-3 overall and 4-2 in the conference. In the month of October, they played. They played 5 games since our last ranking. They did lose big at Ohio State, but they did win big against Washington. Looked really bad against Michigan State. Looked really good against Northwestern, and looked really good against Wisconsin. Joe, in the last 4 games, they put up 43 times. That's not something that we've seen much from Iowa. And while it's still really inconsistent and ugly at times, I think it is stock up from our last rankings.
It is stock up, Sean. I do. The one piece of bad news I'll give them is it's taken them a while to get to Brendan Sullivan from Cade McNamara. I do think that's unfortunate the way it ended for Cade, but I do think it is ultimately better for this football team based on their last 2 performances. Their defense is still stout. I think the Michigan State game was a one-off. I think really the offense accosted them in that game. And I think the United Atmosphere and MSU's best game of the season is what did them in there. All that said, Sean, give me Iowa in 5th place. I think a lot of Iowa fans are going to be disappointed seeing these performances now because this is ultimately could have been possible, especially the game against Iowa State and Michigan State. And those are 2 games, if Iowa was in the stretch they were in now, they would probably win both of them and be sitting at a nice 8-1 with a trip to Indy. That's probable, especially with this soft remaining schedule as we sit here today.
Yep, I've got them in 5th as well. And again, they're like Minnesota, Joe. They might hear their name and called on the top 25 tomorrow. Now, the playoffs are totally out of reach for them, and they don't have a tough schedule. And the negative part of that is that you don't get any big resume boosting wins, and so unfortunately they'll be headed to a bowl, probably a good one. But at this point, that's all that's really left for Iowa. All right, Joe, we've got the Indiana Hoosiers up next. Definitely the talk of really the entire sports world at this point. Kurt Cignetti and the Hoosiers are 8-0. They are at top of the Big Ten standings right now at 6-0. They're 9-0 actually overall, 6-0 in the conference. In October went pretty well for them. They win big at Northwestern. They went big at home against Nebraska. They win big at home against Washington. And then they win big on the road at Michigan State. The schedule is getting tougher, but as of now, Joe, Indiana's passed every test with flying colors.
They have passed every test with flying colors, Sean, and we're going to both rank them 3rd. Spoiler alert for everyone. But the reason I don't have them over Ohio State and Oregon, and maybe some Penn State fans are going to scream that Indiana has not played anyone, they're doing what top 10 teams are supposed to do to the inferior opponents. They are dominating them, and sure, maybe it's not 4 quarters of domination, but by the 4th quarter, it's sheer domination. So I don't really want to hear that, they're not blowing them out in every single quarter. That's a ridiculous argument. Let's face it, Sean. Has Indiana been perfect? No. Their record's perfect. Have they been perfect in games? They've showed weaknesses. I think their defense has some things to work on. I think tackling could be a little more crisp. I do think if teams don't turn the ball over against them, that could pose certain problems to the defense, especially if they're on the field longer than they're accustomed to. But for now, Indiana's in 3rd, Sean, and again, the only reason I can't put them above an Ohio State, and certainly not even close to an Oregon, is the fact that they have not beaten anyone of note. And I think that'll include Michigan this weekend if they beat them. I do think they have the chance to shut me and a lot of people up if they do beat Ohio State. And if they even play them really competitively, I'll also be very impressed. And 3rd for Indiana in football, if anyone's going to be mad about that, if I asked you that 2 months ago, I think you would know your answer better than mine.
Yeah, Joe, a bunch of records are really coming out about this Indiana team and how great they are. They are 50. They've scored 51 touchdowns in 9 games, which is pretty incredible. And they also weren't losing in a game all season until this last game to Michigan State, and that was quickly turned around. And really, by halftime, that game was over. So the team is relentless. They don't give up. And you do think that while they haven't had one yet, if they do have a bad half, you would think they might be able to overcome that against a team that they're definitely better than. Now, if they're losing 17-3 at halftime to Ohio State, well, that's probably it. But they have as much firepower as any team in this conference. The defensive concerns have they've definitely improved some aspects of the defense recently. Now, they may be playing worse offenses, and well, who's up next? It's another offense that can struggle. So maybe you can build more confidence there. But, Joe, this Ohio State game in a couple of weeks is going to be really, really big, and I think going to be a lot closer than people think because nobody has been able to stop this Indiana team. They have over 47 points per game on average, and if you just play a little defense when you're doing that, you're going to win a lot of games. So Curtis Rourke did return after just one game missed with a thumb injury. He got through the Michigan State game all right until, all the starters were pulled late. But that is a concern that obviously if he goes down, they're not as good. But, Joe, Indiana's ranked 8th in the AP poll, 6th in the coaches poll, and will most likely be in the top 12 in the college football playoff release tomorrow night. So Kurt Cignetti's definitely the national coach of the year at this point, and Indiana fans have a real chance to see themselves in the college football playoff, which is a pretty wild statement to make. They move up big. They were 7th for me, 8th for you last time, and 3rd I think is the lowest you can put them after what we've seen so far. All right, Joe, we've got Illinois up next, and that 7th spot is the one that's left. It's been a tough couple weeks for the Illini. They did lose at home to Minnesota despite being the ranked team. The Gophers were favored, and guess what? Vegas knows their stuff as the Gophers come up on top. But Illinois, they come up short on the road at Penn State. That was before our last rankings. They come up short on the road in Eugene, Oregon. But at 6-3 and 3-3, really until this Minnesota game, they've taken care of business at home against opponents that they're better than. But this loss to the Gophers is definitely a step back.
Yeah, I'd say it's a step back, and I don't really even want to indicate that the Oregon loss was a step back. I think that's probably shock to most people. I want to talk about their 2 wins. I know the Purdue win, everyone's going to be like, that's barely a win, but at the end of the day, what they showed the next week against Michigan, effectively dominating them. Michigan had not scored that low. That number. Sorry, it gets me bad even thinking about it. Michigan has scored usually more than 7 points in a game. That was their lowest total since 2014 in a decade. So I think that speaks volumes to Illinois' defense. I do think it's still really good. I think the Purdue and the Oregon you can knock off. One was a fluke, the Purdue one, because they couldn't prepare for Brown on film. And Oregon's offense is going to do bad things to any good defense based on the versatility. With that said, they are in 7th shot. I think they drop a spot. I don't think that's that bad a drop. I do think you looked at their October and thought going into it they would lose 2 games, albeit they probably didn't think it would be a Minnesota loss in early November. They probably would have thought, Michigan loss and Oregon loss. So kind of the chalk held there. I think they have a lot of good opportunities to get to 10 wins this year. They can't lose any more though. I think the whole game against Michigan State at Rutgers and against Northwestern, I think those are all games they're going to be favored in. And if they could get to 10 wins, that's more than a successful season for Illinois, something they haven't sniffed in a while. So good overall year for the Illini. Last 2 performances were disappointing, but I do think they can make it right by just playing their brand of football.
And it's still an incredible stock up from where we had them at the beginning of the year, Joe. I think I had them at second to last, and you had them 4 or 5 spots above that. But if you end up 9-3 at the end of the day, you have to say that's a good season for Illinois, and they're certainly on pace for that as of now. So everybody can see our 3rd edition of Power Rankings filled in. Joe, we're probably going to make this a monthly thing, so when the calendars turn to December, look out for version 4 of the power rankings. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We're going to have a ton of videos coming out this week, whether it's Big Ten football or college basketball, as the season tipped off tonight as of the time of recording.